It's just not like, should I have an affair with my stepson or should I murder this man? So gnarly to me. I eat that up. You know, good for her. I like mine nice and thick, nice and juicy. The more unhinged a person is, the more interested I am to read about their life. We are eating good. But like, again, good for her. Hi, I'm Sam. There's quite literally no one asking me to do this, but I would like to share with you all of the books that I think shaped my taste in literature. So I was toying with the idea of making a video of all of my favorite books of all time, but I was finding it really difficult to make that list, mainly because I feel like I'm still a relatively new reader now as an adult. I obviously read a ton as a kid and in high school, but it's really only been a couple years since I've really found my taste and found books that I really enjoy. So I felt like I was kind of putting this video off, and then I saw a video from the channel Tomorrow and Still describing each of the books that sort of steered them to their current taste. And I found that video to be so interesting, and that is when I decided that I would rather make a video like that instead of just a list of favorites, because I'm sure if you've been watching my videos for a while, you can probably kind of glean most of my favorites from those videos. And I guess if after you watch this, you're still really itching for me to just have one video where I have all of my all-time favorites compiled together, then let me know in the comments. I can still make that video very easily. I will always be glad to speak endlessly about my favorite books. But nevertheless, I have prepared so much more for this video than I have for any video before. I have this really long script, so if you see me like looking at my computer, it's because I feel like I learned a lot about myself making this script and hopefully in making this video. So this one feels like my most personal video to date. I thought it made sense for me to kind of work chronologically. So I will start with some books that I read as a child. Obviously, I didn't realize at the time why I enjoyed them, but I have sort of made a list of themes that I think I now enjoy as an adult that I was introduced to in these books that I'm about to describe. This isn't really the first book I remember really enjoying as a child, but it's one that I obviously still own, and I feel like I go back to it every year. And whenever people ask me about my all-time favorite books, this one is always one that jumps to the front of my mind. So that is Clockwork by Philip Pullman. This is probably like a middle grade book. This is a lot more fantastical than I would say my taste is now, but what I really liked about it is that it had dark philosophical themes, so reflections on morality, fate, and human nature. This deals with moral complexity, so really probing the gray areas of what's right and what's wrong. This has very dark atmosphere and gothic elements, so very like brooding, eerie atmosphere, but obviously since it's a children's book, it's still kind of balancing moments of whimsy with those darker themes, and it has a darker, more unsettling tone. So this book really strikes that balance between being enchanting and sort of a little haunting. This is also the first book that I can remember that has interwoven storylines. So each chapter we're following a different character, and then by the end of the story, the characters' paths have crossed. This explores identity and fate and the human condition, really examining the difference between free will and fate, and how characters grapple with their sense of self. And as I said, these weren't things that I was able to clock when I was a child, but now having reflected back on it as an adult, I think this is such a foundational book for me because it's one that I distinctly remember introducing me to these themes that I now know I love. So then, in keeping with books that I read as a child that I have felt really impacted by, we have The Phantom Tollbooth. What the? Apparently I had some sticky tabs in there that I did not know about. So yeah, I haven't read this as an adult. I think I was planning to reread it to annotate it now as an adult. However, this is The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster. This is a pretty classic, like Alice in Wonderland. A child gets taken into this fantastical world, and then it ends up being a lot deeper than it seems on the surface. This is the first book that I remember being introduced to the joy of whimsical wordplay. So really clever use of language, playful use of language, very witty, wry humor, and also kind of challenging the reader and kind of bumping up against the fourth wall sometimes. This is the first book I remember introducing me to the theme of absurdity and absurd humor. So we have a bizarre, dreamlike world and these surreal elements. And while this is a very whimsical book, it's still extremely thought-provoking, and I felt like there were so many really poignant lines that have stuck with me into adulthood. So I had to include this as a huge shaper of my taste. Okay, next I have two books that stood out in my mind as being really important in middle school and high school. One of them I read for my own enjoyment. I just randomly found it at the library. And then the other one I remember being assigned to have to read it for school. And I've grouped them together because they have kind of similar themes. So the first is The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. This is the one that I found at the library and randomly picked up. And then I don't have a physical copy of this book, which I was kind of surprised by. But the other one is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So these two books kind of stuck in my mind as introducing me to the concepts of really intimate, complex relationships. And we're really following one or maybe two characters really closely. We get a really close look at these characters and how they move through the world. So exploring personal relationships and the often painful side of relationships, the complexity of human connections, and again, really exploring the human condition. I love the idea that no matter how different we are, for example, a farmer in 20th century China, you would not think I'd have a ton in common with that person. But I think really good literature can show you that there are so many similarities in how we experience the world just by being human. And I love that. I eat that up. I think Of Mice and Men and The Good Earth also explore tragic and thought-provoking themes. So really difficult subjects like dreams deferred, broken promises, the inevitability of loss. Stories that tackle deep, uncomfortable themes, especially exploring the fragility of hope and the harshness of reality. So The Good Earth and Of Mice and Men were the two that I remember introducing me to sort of like that portion of my reading taste. Now we are moving really solidly into my high school years. Two of these I was assigned to read for class, and then the third one I picked up because I was intrigued by the synopsis. So the two I was required to read for school were Lord of the Flies by William Golding and a short story called Hunters in the Snow by Tobias Wolff. And then the third that I read just for fun is Battle Royale by Koshin Takami, and this is translated by Nathan Collins. I have grouped these together because I think that they all have brutal and unflinching violence that really confront human brutality and the darker aspects of existence. These books are what made me realize I was interested in the grotesque and violent side of human nature, and these books really portray it in a stark yet poetic language. For sure, Battle Royale and The Lord of the Flies are more like dystopian existential horror, so more of a speculative lean, whereas Hunters in the Snow is more grounded in reality. But these are exploring dehumanization and existential crises. These are disturbing, surreal societies that are critiquing and providing social commentary. I enjoy narratives that explore the inner struggle of characters as they grapple with their flaws, mistakes, choices they make, and potentially moral failings. So these ones definitely introduced me to the more brutal, dark, yet literary portion of my taste. Okay, and then I knew I had to have a whole section just for Junji Ito because he was so integral in forming my taste as it is now today. So I couldn't pick just one work that really influenced my taste, so I ended up picking 3 series. So the first Junji Ito that I ever remember reading were these Museum of Terror omnibuses. So these are out of print now, but they basically are collections of his short stories. They mostly have the Tomie stories, which have now been assembled into this giant Tomie tome that is in print and available for purchase. But my first taste with Junji Ito was in these Museum of Terror volumes. I also remember reading his volumes called Flesh Colored Horror. Similarly, it was more of his short story collections, and a lot of those short stories have now been curated and put into the Viz Media releases that we see now today. But then I also have such a soft spot in my heart for Gyo, which I feel like people don't talk about as much. People talk a lot about Tomie and Uzumaki, but I think Gyo, at the end of the day, might be the one that unsettled me the most. The idea of dead bodies being put onto these mechanical legs, which are then powered by the gases that are produced by their decaying bodies, is just so gnarly to me. I think more people should be reading Gyo because it does not get as much love as it deserves. And then finally, Uzumaki, of course. This is probably my favorite Junji Ito series, this one was so crazy to me. This was my first time really coming face to face with the uncanny. So we have eerie, unsettling events, horror that really provokes this sense of unease. There's not really a ton of these jump scares. It is a lot of this creeping dread, getting under your skin. Stories that are both grotesque and psychologically disturbing. I also think this was the first time I really saw an author distorting reality as well as the human form. This was very much my first introduction into the beauty that is body horror. And that is my next point on the list, body horror and transformation. These really horrific transformations and permutations of the human form, where physical or mental changes are used to elicit both fascination and disgust, which often reflect larger social anxieties. We have themes of obsession and destruction. Tomie especially is a character who elicits madness in those around her, leading to tragic and horrifying outcomes. These are definitely the first books that introduced me to the concept of fascination devolving into obsession, devolving into madness. I also really like that these aren't 100% supernatural. It really is a collision between supernatural and reality, and I think that this collision is often unsettling and dangerous, and having the parts of reality there almost makes it even more uncanny, because these parts that should be a source of comfort actually end up contributing more to the horror. Definitely helped shape my interest in psychological horror that gets under the skin, where the character's internal battles or obsessions are just as terrifying as the external threats. Junji Ito often uses the juxtaposition between beauty and horror, and how something can be disturbingly beautiful, and this concept of aesthetic horror. Tomie especially is a beautiful but horrific character, embodying the intersection of attraction and repulsion. We have the grotesque wrapped in this very appealing, aesthetically pleasing package. And I also think that Tomie was the first time where I was like, you know, good for her, you know? And now as an adult, I realize that I really enjoy feminist and gender fluid perspectives. So I think that Tomie definitely challenges societal norms, what it means to be a woman, and how women can be alienated if they are not behaving appropriately within the cishet white male patriarchal design. So that's Junji Ito. This is probably going to be the longest part of the video because he had such a pivotal role in shaping my taste. Okay, now we are shifting to adulthood. So I would say the book that has been the strongest force in shaping my taste has been Threats by Amelia Gray. So I discovered this book shortly after starting my YouTube channel, and I truly do not think I would be the reader I am today without this book. Like, this rearranged my chromosomes, this changed who I am as a person, this changed what I like to read. And I say all of that and it sounds very hyperbolic, and honestly it probably kind of is, because in making this script for this video, it made me realize that a lot of the themes that I love in this I was sort of already introduced to in some of the books I talked about earlier, but this was the first book that really brought it all into focus for me and really streamlined how I pick books now. So this is about a man who has lost his wife under mysterious circumstances, and the whole time throughout the whole novel we're following him as he's trying to figure out what happened. And it's really this exquisite exploration of the difference between grief and mental illness and potentially guilt. This is very dark and psychological. This is probably the first book that introduced me to my love for novels about grief. This has a lot of isolation and psychological tension. We're delving very deep into the main character's psyche. This is my first foray into absurdism as an adult. So this is very absurd and surreal. There are a lot of strange occurrences blended with the main character's normal everyday life. Reality is distorted, and it creates this really uneasy, uncanny, eerie sense of dread, but also making you really curious and spurring you to continue reading on. We have a very unreliable narrator. This is very ambiguous. The ending is ambiguous. There's this overall sense of detachment. Even though we're so deep into the main character's mind, there's still this overarching sense of detachment from reality, the character, the setting, everything. I love grappling with the complexities that leaves us with, and the really unreliable and fragmented perspective. I like books that are disturbing yet thought-provoking, so really uncomfortable situations with an undercurrent of thoughtfulness. This really provokes a sense of unease and fear, but also is engaging on a deeper intellectual level. I like emotional and intellectual unease, and exploring the isolation of individuals in an increasingly disconnected world. Okay, so now I kind of want to go through and summarize the themes that I have sort of described with all of these books, and give you some examples of books that I love that kind of fall within those themes. So I do also want to say that a lot of these books could probably fit into multiple of these categories, but kind of just for my brain, I wanted to organize it while also giving you guys more of a taste of kind of some favorites of mine. So the first is psychological horror, unreliable narrators, and dread. That's sort of my first category of books that I really love. For this category, I have chosen The Pillowman by Martin McDonagh. This is about a man who is arrested in this totalitarian state because there have been a string of child murders that are alarmingly similar to some of his short stories that he's written. So this is a really short play that is incredibly well done and definitely has psychological horror and this incredible creeping sense of dread. We have Come Closer by Sarah Gran. This is a classic mental illness versus possession horror story that is just done so well. Like, I've never seen that setup done better than this. And then last in this section is We Can Never Leave This Place by Eric LaRocca. This is about a young girl in a war-torn country, and her mother, in an effort to protect them, brings these strangers into the home. But as they spend more and more time there, the girl feels that the strangers that have been brought in are actually more of a threat to them than protection. So it's this really uncomfortable, tense story, and the whole time you're kind of just like waiting for the bad thing that you know is going to happen. Okay, my next section is my longest because I feel like this has kind of become my favorite category, and many of the books that I like fall into this category. So that category is existential exploration, alienation, and isolation. So for that, we have Stoner by John Williams. We're literally just following this man in Missouri who goes to college and then stays in academia, but he's just like the loneliest, kind of saddest, most heartbreaking character. And John Williams' prose is just like next fucking level. When I think of isolation and loneliness, I think of Stoner. Next is Walking Practice by Dolki Min, and this was translated by Victoria Caudle. Another kind of like undercurrent of this category is an outsider's perspective on the human condition and humanity. So in this, we're following an alien who has crash landed onto Earth and must contort their physical appearance to survive. This is really funny and absurd, but I wanted to put it into this category because at its heart, it really is exploring the loneliness and isolation and alienation of our main character. Kind of in that same vein, we have Open Throat by Henry Hoke. In this, we're following a gay mountain lion who is providing perspective on humans. They actually are forced from their home in the Hollywood Hills due to climate change, and this forces them to be closer and closer to humans and have to interact with them more closely. And it's just kind of heartbreaking, but also I love, like I said, getting this outsider's perspective on humanity. Next, we have Two by Inio Asano, A Girl on the Shore in Solanin. Inio Asano has like classic slice of life vibes in all of his stories, but there is always this sense of existential exploration and sort of like, what's the point of it all? Why should I even try? And his ability to capture that sense of ennui is unparalleled. I cry pretty much in every book I read of his because his ability to capture humanity and human emotion is unlike anyone else. Next is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, and this was translated by a person that I'm about to tell you. And this was translated by Ginny Tapley Takemori. We're dealing with this young girl who feels literally like an alien. She's waiting for her alien family to come rescue her from Earth. She deals with a lot of trauma throughout her life, and then this ends with a really violent, crazy ending. But again, I think the main point of this book is the sense of alienation and isolation that our main character feels. Next is Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. This is just following a woman who is mentally ill and feels very isolated because it's like she's the only sick person in this world of able-bodied people. and she doesn't understand why she can't just get better. She really wants to get better, but she can't. I just think I really loved this one so much because I resonated and related so much to this woman, so I just loved it. And then lastly is one I haven't really talked about on the channel, that is Oh Honey by Emily Austen. People don't talk about this one. This is my favorite Emily Austen to date. It's very similar to her other work where we're following this female protagonist who's just like quirky, offbeat, bizarro, absurd. But this is a lot darker. We're following a drug addict who is on probation, and we know very little about her life until we continue reading and we get these little pieces, and then we realize how dark the story really is. I think more people should be reading this. Okay, and then my next section is Violence, Survival, and Dark Societies. So the first on that list is The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock. This could go into many other categories, but this is very dark and very violent. We are following multiple storylines in rural southern Ohio and West Virginia from the end of World War II to the 1960s. The reason I put it into this category is because when I think about this book, I just remember how dark and violent it is, and I loved it for that. Next is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. This is still the most violent book I've ever read to date. We are following basically this gang of men on the Texas-Mexico border in the 1850s, and they are conscripted to hunt down, murder, rape, pillage a bunch of Native Americans. It is unflinchingly brutal and violent, and I loved it. And then we have Paradise by Fernanda Melchor, and this was translated by Sophie Hughes. In this, we're following two men in a luxury housing complex. One of them lives in the housing complex, one of them works there. So this is a very violent exploration of class and misogyny and violence against women, and I think more people should be reading it. Okay, the next section we have is dark satire, absurdity, and moral dilemmas. First on that list is In Praise of the Stepmother by Mario Vargas Llosa, and this was translated by Helen Lane. This is about a woman who starts having an affair with her elementary school age stepson, and it is told in the most deliciously beautiful prose. It is so absurd. It's obviously posing this extreme moral dilemma, very much blending dark humor with these deep philosophical themes. In that same vein, we have Tampa by Alyssa Nutting. In Praise of the Stepmother walked so Tampa could run. Tampa is about a female pedophile who becomes a middle school teacher in order to start preying on young boys. We are in the mind of the woman, so it's very disturbing, but again, it's very much blending this humor and this very obvious moral dilemma that should not even be a dilemma. It's very clear what she should and should not be doing, but it's just done so masterfully. Next is Ava's Man by Gail Jones. This is about a woman who has recently been imprisoned for killing a man. So throughout the novel, we learn about her relationship with this man, as well as how men have interacted with her throughout her entire life since she was a child, and how often those interactions were abusive. So we're really following this woman's trauma, and through her, we're able to examine these deeper societal and personal issues. And then last is The First Bad Man by Miranda July. This one's definitely the lightest book out of the four that I've presented in this category. This one is definitely very funny, very absurd. It's way less dark, so it kind of more is just like humorous and absurd. But I would say we're still kind of exploring some moral dilemmas. It's just not like, should I have an affair with my stepson or should I murder this man, you know? The next category is surrealism, reality bending, and non-linear narratives. So I have two options for this, but again, so many of these could fit into multiple. The first is another Inio Asano, Nijigahara Holograph. This is like the book exemplifying a non-linear narrative. So this is following two timelines. The first is kind of during the characters' high school days, and then the second timeline is when they're now adults and having to sort of confront a horrific event that happened in their past. This is very surreal, very reality bending, very David Lynchian if you've seen any of his films. And then we have The Hike by Drew Magary. This is very similar to The Phantom Tollbooth. This is like a grown-up Phantom Tollbooth with more violence. Period. That's the end of the sentence. So this is following a man who decides to go on a hike to kill some time while he's on a work retreat. And when he is on the hike, he ends up kind of stumbling into this crazy reality. So it's very Alice in Wonderland, but it is more violent. He's trying to survive and get back to his reality. And it's really surreal and absurd and funny. The next category is dark feminism, control, and rebellion. The first on that list, I don't have a physical copy yet, is The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin. I feel like this doesn't need that much introduction, but for those who don't know, this is about a woman who moves to this new community called Stepford with her family, which is like white people utopia. And she starts to sense that something is a little off with all of the women in this community. And she starts to become more and more paranoid that she's going to be forced to conform into how all of these women are behaving. It's peak psychological horror, so much creeping dread and buildup. But when I think about this book, the first thing that comes to mind is the feminism and how this story is really examining gender roles. Next, we have Mother Thing by Ainsley Hogarth. In this, we're following a female main character who is navigating this situation after her mother-in-law dies and starts to haunt their basement. This is a certified weird girly who's trying to be a normal girl. You know, she would love Stepford. She would love to be forced to conform, but she's just too weird for it to work. And the more she tries to be normal, the weirder it gets. And this also ends with a shocking act of violence. But like, again, good for her. And then last in this category is Slewfoot by Brom. This is like the ultimate good for her. You know, we're following this woman in colonial USA who is trying to just live her life and farm some food and survive. And her community hates her because they hate to see a girl winning, you know? This is obviously during like the Salem witch trial era, but she befriends this entity that looks kind of like the devil. And the more she is tormented by these people and sort of like accused of being this witch and this person that she's not, the more she's like, hey, if it is a devil you seek, then it is a devil you shall have. Next, we have psychological thrillers and slow-burning suspense. So in this, we have Hawk Mountain by Connor Habib. This is about a man who is a single father, and one day he runs into his childhood bully, now as an adult, and his childhood bully starts trying to worm his way into his life, and it's just so unsettling. The whole time you're like waiting for something awful to happen until it maybe happens. In that same vein, we have Perfect Days by Rafael Montes. This is about a psychotic medical student who kidnaps a woman and basically orchestrates it so that her family has no idea that anything's wrong. So we're following this woman as she is trying to regain her autonomy and her freedom from this insane man. And then next is Confessions by Kanai Minato, translated by Steven Snyder. I don't have my physical copy because I lent it out to my sister, but this is a fantastic psychological thriller with such a great buildup and such a great payoff. I love psychological thrillers that don't just have one big payoff at the end. There are sort of like multiple sprinkled throughout, and it's like, man, we are eating good. That one is about a woman whose students kill her daughter. That's not a spoiler, that's on the back of the book. And it's like she's trying to get revenge. And then the last category is self-destruction, obsession, and unhinged characters. And all of the books that I have in this section are ones that I've already talked about. I feel like most of the books that I read are dealing with this subject in some way. For sure, unhinged characters. The more unhinged a person is, the more interested I am to read about their life. Those are the books that I feel like really shaped my taste and the reader that I am today. All of these books that I talked about, I love with my whole heart. So you can like this video if you want. You could comment if you've read any of these books, if you liked them. If you have any recommendations for me based on what I described my reading taste as, I would love to hear them. I'm always trying to fatten up my TBR as much as I can. I like mine nice and thick, nice and juicy. So let me have the recs. I would love to hear them. You could subscribe if you wanted. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in whatever video I make next. Bye.